Great. Well, I think the folks who are here, and other folks will maybe join us as we go. Welcome so much, everyone, to Food and Farming in a Climate Emergency. We're so glad that you can join us here this evening. My name is Molly McCracken. I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba office, and I'm your host this evening for this wonderful panel of presentations and some time for questions and discussion. For anybody watching, this is also being live streamed on the Manitoba Eco Network Facebook page. So you can tell anybody else who might be interested that they could watch on Facebook if they like, on the Manitoba Eco Network Facebook page, and it'll also be archived there as well. I want to start by recognizing what a challenging time that we're all in right now. COVID is surging across the country, and Manitoba has some of the highest per capita rates, and new restrictions were announced today, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And I wish to pass on my sympathies to anyone who's lost someone due to COVID or has a friend or family member who's struggling tonight. We're sending you all good energy. There's certainly a lot of stress right now, and I just want to acknowledge that and also welcome us all just to take a deep breath and know that we're here together online safely, and we're going to have a good discussion here tonight in the context of another really important issue facing us, with also COVID in our minds as well. And just to note that all of us are coming from situations where we're facing inconveniences, but those pale really in the comparison to what's important, which is saving lives and making sure our health system can respond to people's health needs. And one of the things that we're seeing through this crisis is that communities can come together and pivot in the face of a huge challenge, and that governments have a very strong role in doing this. We can see that business and huge multinational corporate interests can take a back seat in the times of crisis and to public health. And that it is a time of crisis where huge changes are made, and certainly the climate crisis is a crisis, and we'll be talking about that more tonight. Milton Friedman famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And so when we're talking about the climate movement, when we're almost out of time to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get to net zero, we need to take this moment to also realize how we can achieve that more quickly now that people are primed for some sort of changes. So I'm interested in those kind of conversations to myself about how we can push forward progressive change here when it comes to food and climate. And I'm very, very excited to be talking about food and farming tonight. I have so much respect for farmers and growers and people who feed people. Farmers feed cities, as they say. I know some farmers. I'm lucky to know some. They are true heroes, tremendously creative, inventive, and innovative, hardworking folks. And so we're just so lucky that we have Amber here, producer here with us to share some of her knowledge, as well as Darren Qualdman and Jeanette Silverlane. We are broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And the electricity being used to power my computer and our computers comes from northern Manitoba, from Treaty 5 territory, and the water that sustains me here is from Treaty 3 territory. And it's inspiring to know that Indigenous people lived on these lands prior to settlement in relationship and respect with the land for thousands of years. And we certainly have a lot to learn from Indigenous people, and particularly when it comes to eating sustainably. I'd like to give a big thank you to the Eco Network for hosting, co-hosting tonight, and to Emily, who's our tech support. We'll be talking with Emily, who's doing the wizardry in the background to make this event happen. And we just love the Eco Network, and thank you to all your work here in Manitoba. Thank you to the National Farmers Union for co-hosting. So glad that you can be with us, Darren Qualdman, and to the Winnipeg Food Council, Jeanette Silverley, and also to the Climate Action Team, which is a coalition that I'm involved in at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And just speaking of that, I wanted to note that today is an auspicious day because our office at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives actually released a paper by Darren and several other authors. It's called Concentration Matters, Farmland Inequality on the Prairies Today, which is about the concentration of ownership of farmland. So I'll put that link in the chat. It's an important paper noting concentration of farmland and ideas for how we can address that. And I also wanted to note, speaking of other research, the Climate Action Team, which I'm a part of, along with the Wilderness Committee, Climate Change Connection, Green Action Center, and the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, is on a project called The Road to Resilience. And we have discussion papers about what needs to be done to truly get to net zero here in Manitoba. And so I'm going to put a link to that, the discussion paper on food, in the chat later, and we welcome your feedback on that. It looks at what changes need to be implemented in order to achieve climate change resilience for food in Manitoba. So I'll give some resources. Please feel free to use the chat. You can find that at the bottom of the screen, and you can say hello in there if you have any questions. We will be taking questions at the end, and we'll be sourcing those from the chat. We ask that please keep questions constructive and respectful in the chat, because we're all here to learn together. Some other just notes on Zoom. You'll see at the very top right-hand corner, it says view. So you can click on that, and then you can go to speaker view for when we're ready to make presentations. And that way you'll just see the person speaking and their presentation. We will have time for questions to discussion at the end. So you might want to change it to gallery view, and that way you can see all the panelists in one screen, but suggesting you go to speaker view for the presentations. And also, I'm excited that we do have some polls to include in our agenda tonight, some questions to ask you along the way interspersed. The organizers wanted to make this event interactive as possible, given that we're online, and also to get the pulse of our virtual room here together and understand where people are coming from. So we are going to be doing some polls as well. So yeah, I'll just go over the agenda very quickly. We're going to start with Darren Qualdman, who's the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action for the National Farmers Union. He's going to give a presentation. We will have a poll, and then we're going to go to Amber McNish, who grew up on a small cattle farm in southwestern Manitoba, and she is knowledgeable in regenerative farming practices. And then we're going to have another poll, and then we're going to go to Jeanette Silverley, who's the coordinator of the Winnipeg Food Council. Another poll, and then we have some time for questions and answers. And that concludes our evening together. So yeah, I think we'll just get started here with our very first poll. So I'll ask Emily to please pull that up. All right, so I don't know if you've done this before, but it's pretty simple. So this is the question, and then you can vote on one of these responses. So how urgent is it that the government of Manitoba take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And you can select one. So the options are not urgent, somewhat urgent, very urgent, really, really friggin' urgent, we're all gonna die, and not sure. So this is, do you have the pulse of the room of how people are feeling and levels of concern about climate change? And we can watch how many people have voted here of the people who are in attendance. So yeah, I'll just let the voting take place. And when we're close to 100%, we'll wind it up. I see a lot of people feeling this is very, very urgent, which is what the science is saying, of course. All right, I think we might have topped out at 77%. Oh, a couple more people are voting. So yes, we have really, really friggin' urgent has got the maximum amount of votes at 54%. Second is very urgent. And then we're all going to die. I guess those people are very concerned. And then somewhat urgent. So it sounds like we're all quite concerned that this is a very urgent problem, and that's no surprise since we're all here in this event here tonight. So maybe we'll stop sharing that. Are we back to the main view? Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Darren Qualtman, who is the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action for the National Farmers Union. He's the author of the 2019 report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, and the 2019 book, Civilization Critical, Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future. He farmed for 2 decades and has academic degrees in history, biology, and political studies. So welcome, Darren, over to you.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Very good. Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Very good. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to present here today. My name is Darren Qualtman, as Molly said. I work with the National Farmers Union, an organization of farm families across Canada. If you are a farmer and not a member, please consider joining us in our work. If you're a non-farmer and want to help build a more nutritious, delicious, sustainable food system, please consider joining as an associate member as well. My talk is Food and Farming in a Climate Emergency, Agricultural Emissions in Manitoba. I noted that the poll results showed that we were very concerned about climate change, and that fits in with our theme tonight, that we have a food system and a farming system in a climate emergency. So I have 18 minutes tonight, and I'll just give my presentation in 4 parts. The first part is an overview of the climate crisis, both globally and particularly how that might play out in Manitoba. Then I'll talk about why agricultural emissions reductions matter so much in Manitoba. I'll give you an overview of what the emissions coming out of agriculture look like to set the stage for the final part of my talk, where I'll outline how we might reduce those agricultural emissions. So part 1, the climate crisis globally and in Manitoba. So despite a lot of progress so far, as we now stand following the 2015 Paris Agreement, we're on track for a global temperature increase this century, not of 1.5 degrees, which is the goal, and not even 2 degrees, which is seen as the danger line. We're on track to warm 3.2 degrees globally. And how do we know that? After the 2015 Paris climate talks, many countries, including Canada, committed to reduce emissions. Canada committed to reduce by 30% by 2030, the European Union more, other countries a bit less. And after those commitments came in, scientists at the United Nations and elsewhere put those emission reduction targets and commitments into their climate models. And they gave every country in the world the benefit of the doubt. They assumed that every government would do what they committed to do. Canada would reduce by 30%, etc. And they asked those climate models, if everybody did what they committed to do, by how much would the planet warm? And the answer that those climate models came back with should really concern us, because the answer was 3.2 degrees of warming. That's the track we're on now, even with carbon taxes and electric vehicle mandates, etc. Now, 3.2 degrees of warming is bad news for Earth, but it's even worse news for Manitoba and the prairies. because continental interiors and higher latitudes warm at twice the rate of the planetary average. And that's confirmed by Environment and Climate Change Canada and a whole range of reports. The center of the continent, where Manitoba and the Prairie provinces lie, and in the northern part of the continent, is warming very, very quickly. So if the Earth is on track for 3.2 degrees, Manitoba and the rest of the prairies are on track for 6.4 degrees of warming this century. That's nearly 1 degree per decade. Just give you a bit of a tour of what's happening in the atmosphere. Very briefly, there's 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide is the one we hear a lot about. This is a graph of the last 800,000 years of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations in Earth's atmosphere. You can see for about 800,000 years, CO2 concentrations did not peak above 300 parts per million. They're now closing in on 420 and almost certainly to go past 500. The concentrations in the atmosphere right now are higher than at any time in the last 800,000 to a million years, and they're rising about 100 times faster than anything we can find evidence of in the last million years. Second major greenhouse gas, methane. It's about 28 times more powerful than CO2 when it comes to warming. The main sources are energy production, oil, natural gas, and coal, also landfills, also cattle. You can see that this graph is a little shorter term. It's only 10,000 years, but you can see for about 9,900 years, methane concentration stayed fairly constant at about 600 or 700 parts per billion. But in the last 100 or 200 years, they've spiked quite dramatically. They've almost tripled since the 1800s. Third major greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide. It's up to highest level in at least 800,000 years. The main source of nitrous oxide is nitrogen fertilizer use. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So not surprising, if all of the main greenhouse gas concentrations are at record levels and rising fast, temperatures are rising fast as well. So this is the global temperature anomaly. This graph covers 140 years of data. You can see that from about 1880 until the 1970s or early 80s, the temperature trend line was more or less flat, and then it inflects upward quite dramatically. This shows us up about almost 1 degree globally. And as I said, Manitoba and the prairies are about double that. We're closing in on 2 degrees of warming. So it's quite clear from all of these indicators that unless we make and meet more ambitious emission reduction targets, Manitoba and the prairies will warm by 6.4 degrees this century. What we're learning is that our targets are weak, our actions are slow, we're not ambitious enough, and that clearly we need to do more, and we can do more. But we have to up our ambition and we have to move faster. The 6.4 degrees scenario is avoidable if we act, but we really, really, really need to act. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of what some of the worst case scenarios might look like if we don't act more aggressively. Part of acting more aggressively is reducing emissions all throughout the economy. And in Manitoba especially, that means reducing emissions from agriculture. So the second part of my talk focuses in on why agricultural emissions matter so much in Manitoba. Emissions from agriculture and the manufacturing of agricultural inputs make up 42% of all emissions in Manitoba. That's the highest percentage in Canada. And what this means is if Manitoba is to significantly reduce emissions overall, it must reduce emissions from agriculture. So I'll just show you how that looks. This is a graph of emissions in Manitoba in 2018. You can see agriculture and farm input manufacture, and that's mostly nitrogen fertilizer, make up 42% of emissions. Waste, landfills, 3%. Stationary combustion, 14%. That's largely heating, natural gas combustion to heat your house and your water, natural gas combustion to heat commercial and industrial buildings. Down at the bottom there, 39% is transport, diesel and gasoline and trucks and cars. Fugitive sources, 2%. I believe that's largely emissions that escape from coal mines and energy production, although I don't think there's that much of that in Manitoba, but I'll look into that. Again, 42% is the highest percentage in Canada, and that's what this graph shows. This is most of the provinces in Canada, a couple are emitted. The green bars show agricultural emissions as a percentage of total, and you can see Manitoba by far has the highest. So Canada is committed to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030, and they further committed to attain net zero emissions by 2050. And by coincidence, we just had a bill C-12, introduced in the House of Commons this morning, that lays out some of the details around getting to 2050 and the reporting, etc. So Canada wants to reduce by 30% by 2030, net zero by 2050. The implication is that Manitoba is going to do likewise. And it's clear that significant reductions in Manitoba emissions require significant reductions in agricultural emissions. So what are agricultural emissions? How do we understand it? If we're going to reduce them, what are their sources? This is a graph of emissions from agriculture in Manitoba over the last 28 years or so, 1990 to 2018. It looks a bit complicated, but it's actually quite simple. There's three main categories. And I'll just start in the middle, that red category, fuel and energy. When most people think about emissions, they think about combustion, they think about burning gasoline, burning natural gas, burning coal, etc. Carbon dioxide coming from fuel. And certainly there's some of that in agriculture. Our tractors burn diesel fuel, our light trucks burn gasoline, etc. Our combines burn diesel fuel, our houses are heated with natural gas. But that really is a small part of the emissions from agriculture. Most of the emissions are other gases, not carbon dioxide, but nitrous oxide and methane. So you've got the fuel and energy use there in the middle. At the top, that's a lot of methane, mostly methane. The dark green is methane from the mouths of cattle when they digest grass. The light green is methane and nitrous oxide from livestock manure. Down at the bottom, that's the blue sections, that's nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. Most of that is related to nitrogen fertilizer use. The dark blue is soil emissions, nitrous oxide from when farmers use nitrogen, and the light blue is carbon dioxide from nitrogen fertilizer factories. That's what's really driving the upward trend on the top line. The agricultural emissions in Manitoba are up almost 30% from 1990. And what drives that upward is that increase at the bottom, the nitrogen fertilizer related emissions going from about 3 million tons per year in 1990 to about 5 million tons per year in 2018. Nitrogen fertilizer related emissions are going up. Why is that? Because nitrogen fertilizer use is going up very, very fast. This is a graph of the tonnage of nitrogen fertilizer in Manitoba. It's about 52 years, 1968 to about 2019, 2020. And you can see the very steep and continuing upward trend line. Nitrogen fertilizer tonnage has doubled in the last 30 or so years, and it doubled in the 20 or 30 years before that. There's doubling and redoubling in nitrogen fertilizer use. That's driving the increase in emissions in Manitoba. It's not fuel use, it's not livestock, it's nitrogen fertilizer driving that increase. In the interest of time, I'm going to skate by this one fairly quickly. It's a slide on soil carbon sequestration. If somebody wants to ask a question about that in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk more about sequestration. Just to quickly say, sequestration is important, it's real, we need to get as much carbon and soil organic matter into our soil as we can, but it's relatively modest compared to the size of overall emissions from agriculture. So this brings me to the fourth part of my presentation. and that is, how do we reduce emissions from agriculture? So I've got 4 areas of focus and then one at the end as a bonus. So there's really 4 areas of focus. And I was interested when I was reading the report by the Climate Action Team. I was looking at a draft report by the Climate Action Team, very, very good analysis in there. And their 4 key areas were exactly the same: nitrogen, fuel, and manure and livestock. So again, if we're going to reduce emissions, we've got to focus in on nitrogen. That's the big one. We've got to focus in on how farmers use it, but also how we produce it. Some of you may know where this is. That's the Koch brothers fertilizer plant in Brandon. You're looking at the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in all of Manitoba. Nitrogen is a climate change problem. There is nothing else that humans make and use that is a significant source of all 3 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, but nitrogen is. There's nitrous oxide is emitted when it's used, carbon dioxide is emitted when it's produced, and that's what's coming out of this plant, and methane is emitted in the production and distribution of natural gas, which is the main feedstock for making nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer is a huge problem on many, many fronts. So nitrogen fertilizer is a problem, inputs are a problem. When the National Farmers Union wrote its report on the farm crisis and the climate crisis, we came to quite a provocative conclusion. And that conclusion is, agriculture does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. And how can that be? Well, when you think about it in the long term, it becomes very clear. Humans have practiced agriculture for roughly 10,000 years, about 100 centuries. For 99% of that time, for 99 centuries, it was solar powered, low input, and 0 net emission. But just in the last century, as farmers have become more and more dependent on fertilizer and other inputs, it's become very, very high emission. It's not the farming, it's the inputs. The emissions coming out of agriculture are a function of the inputs we're pushing in. And that leads to a very clear and somewhat hopeful solution. Any low emission food production system will be a low input food production system. If you want low emissions, you have to go low input. So the solution is low input and organic agriculture, agroecology, regenerative agriculture. These approaches can help solve our emissions problems, and they can give farmers the opportunity to increase their margins and thus help fix the farm income crisis as well. So we need to reduce input use, we need to reduce nitrogen use. There's a whole bunch of ways we can do that. One is what we call minimum input no-till, where we take the best ideas from organic and the best ideas from zero-till, put them together in a hybrid system that minimizes emissions, keeps yields high, and incorporates the soil building aspects of reduced tillage. Another way we can reduce emissions from nitrogen is to use it more efficiently. 4R nitrogen efficiency best management practices. 4R stands for the right rate, the right product, the right time, and the right place. And we need to produce nitrogen without emissions. We need to capture the greenhouse gases coming off of plants like that Koch brothers facility in Brandon. Fuels, we need to replace fossil fuels with electricity. We need to electrify everything possible, electrify water and building heating, trucks and tractors, maybe on-farm solar, less of a priority in Manitoba, but more of a priority in some of the other provinces. Maybe manure biodigesters to capture methane. We need to retrofit farm buildings so they use less energy, and we need to improve the new buildings that we produce, better building codes. Cattle, as I said, cattle emit methane when they digest grass, but cattle also provide many, many benefits. They support healthy grassland ecosystems, biodiverse grassland ecosystems. They build soil, they cycle nutrients, they support biodiversity, they help farmers manage risks. Cattle have to be kept in the system, but we do need to manage them in ways that maximize benefits and minimize the downsides such as methane. Manure, that's one that's been flagged. It's very important in Manitoba. I am not an expert in that. So I'll leave that to the experts to recommend how those emissions can be reduced. But the good news there is there's a lot of research in Manitoba on the shelf waiting to be put into action to reduce emissions from manure. And finally, the fifth one, the bonus one, is we also need to reduce emissions from everything else. Farms are just one part of the food system. We need to cut emissions throughout, from food transport, from food processing and packaging, retailing and refrigeration, food waste, in-home preparation, and even the choices we make. So I know Jeanette's going to talk a little bit about that. So I'll end there. I hope I'm on time. And thank you very, very much for your attention. I really appreciated the opportunity. And if you want to contact me, my email address is coleman@nfu.ca. And the NFU website is just nfu.ca. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darren, for that very informative presentation, and so much important information in there. I note that it was NFU's 50th anniversary just recently. So that conference was here in Winnipeg. It was great to go and to see how much that group has accomplished in your time, and it's such an important organization. There's a couple of quick technical questions, Darren, I wanted to ask you, and then we can go to the other questions that came up during at the end. But and I don't know if you want to answer this right now, or you could just put the answer in the chat. Virginia asked, what is the source of the temperature data?
The source of the temperature data, I believe, is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, NOAA, out of the US, and I think it's linked to NASA, but yeah, NOAA.
Okay, and then Erica had asked, what are ag inputs? That was earlier on, so I think you answered that, but do you want to just recap?
Sorry about that. Sometimes we get going and just don't notice that people might not be familiar with the lingo. Agricultural inputs are just all the things farmers buy. So it's the fuel, the fertilizer, the chemicals, the machinery, plastic, veterinary drugs, pre-formulated feed, all of that stuff.
Okay, great.
Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Well, we're going to move to our second poll here. I note there are some raised hands. We are going with the chat here. If you can put your questions in the chat, we would appreciate that, because then we can watch the questions as they come and answer them all together for time efficiency's sake. So if there's a reason, for accessibility reasons, you can't ask them in the chat, just let us know by email or something like that. So poll number 2 is going to be coming up shortly here. Emily, could you bring that up? I feel like I need some sort of a poll coming up music to introduce us. So here we are, the second poll, which is, ask the question, in terms of reducing greenhouse gases emissions from Manitoba farms, which of the following activities do you think should be the top policy and funding priorities for the government of Manitoba? And you can select up to 3 of these. So the first one is to fund infrastructure for local food purchases and sales. Number 2, create programs and policies to help farmers reduce emissions from synthetic fertilizer use. Third option, create programs and policies to help farmers reduce emissions from cattle, meat/milk production, including enhanced grazing. The next one, finance or otherwise incentivized on-farm solar power production. The next, fund biogas methane capture from manure and improve manure management. The next one, restoration of degraded land and cultivated soils to pasture systems. More integrated production systems, for example, mixed farming, balanced nutrient cycle. The next one, cover crops, intercropping, and green. Transition to organic production. And then the last one is not sure. So you can fill in up to 3, and we'll leave that there. We have 65 people possible who can vote. So more people have joined since we very first started. So that's great. I did also see in a question in the chat, is this being recorded? Just a reminder, it is on Facebook Live on the Manitoba EcoNet's Facebook page, where it will live as an archive. And it is also going on the Manitoba EcoNet's YouTube channel, I understand. Okay, we have 56% of people voted. A lot of people are interested in the programs and policies to help farmers reduce emissions and synthetic fertilizer use. A lot of people interested in integrated production systems. And then restoration of degraded land is also very popular. Funding infrastructure for local food purchases. These are excellent options. It's hard to choose just 3. Okay, I think we're plateauing at 78% of people voting here. So maybe we should call the poll, Emily. And here we go. Our top response was creating programs and policies to help farmers reduce emissions from synthetic fertilizer use. The next one was more integrated production systems, for example, mixed farming, balanced nutrient cycle. And then at 41%, infrastructure for local food purchases. So that's great, but they all are important. Great, well, yeah, we'll stop sharing that. Thank you so much for participating there. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Amber McNish. Amber McNish grew up on a small cattle farm in the far southwest corner of Manitoba. She recently graduated with her diploma in agribusiness from Assiniboine Community College. For the past 5 years, she has worked as a farmer at Borderland Agriculture, gaining knowledge in regenerative farming practices, bison, and business management. Welcome, Amber.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just share my screen with you here. There we go. So I'm presenting on behalf of the farm tonight. Borderland Agriculture is owned and operated by Brooks and Jen White. We're a regenerative farm located in the southwest corner, and we specialize in grain and bison production. So there's Brooks and Jen, and I'll give you a little bit of a background on me. I am 20 years old and just graduated from ACC with my diploma in agribusiness. I've been a part of the team at Borderland for 5 years now, and I've held many roles and positions over the years, but since returning home from school, I have taken on a more managerial role looking after cover crop, seed sales, grazing plans, and learning the business side of the operation. Brooks is very much a mentor to me, and I look up to him every day, asking lots of questions and learning from his mistakes. He has helped me become the person that I am today, and I'm very excited that I'm able to represent the farm. So this is us. This is our family, as Jen would call it. We typically have 2 full-time employees and then seasonal help in the spring and fall during the busy seasons. We farm around 4,000 acres of grain land and raise 600 bison. Our operation is very diverse with intercrops, seed sales, grazing management, and then direct marketing our bison meat off the farm. So although we continue to decrease crop acres, we actually continue to employ more people on a smaller scale. So what is regenerative agriculture? It describes farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. So there are 6 principles to regenerative agriculture, all of which we follow on the farm, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what they mean to us and then how we implement them. The first one being context, understanding why we do what we do and what our goals are for the farm, and then thinking ahead for future generations. Reduce tillage, minimize the disturbance of your soil as much as you can. Increase diversity, both with crops, grasses, and then the livestock in which consume it all. Keep your soil covered with crop residue, letting your pastures rest. maintain a living root, something that looks a little easier for grass farmers and maybe a little harder for someone who is annually cropping their field, but there is ways. And lastly, integrate livestock, and it can be done through a variety of ways, methods, grazing practices, and something that is a crucial part of our operation. So why do we do what we do and why we're farming this way? The beginning of industrialized ag was a degenerative system. It was based off of single types of industry and infrastructure, and that they once worked together to mimic nature, and that was kind of lost. Brooks's dad was an early adopter of zero-till in the 80s. He recognized that the way he was farming was not for the future. It was mining the soil and degrading the land. The farm then shifted to what we would call sustainable, a word used all too often in ag. And then in 2015, the whole farm made a major shift to what we would call regenerative. Brooks was no longer satisfied with just being sustainable, and we slowly began transferring the farm over with all these principles. And that was about restoring the land, improving it for future generations, but then also our bottom line at the end of the day. The farm had kind of went through about 5 disaster years of either seeding no acres due to wet, flooding, or about 20-30% of the farm was sowed. And that kind of led to us realizing that the water cycle was broken and ultimately our bottom line was hurt. So I'll run you through a little bit of an example of what 3 years on one of our regenerative farms would look like, and then 3 years on a conventional field would look like, and the differences that there is. Starting off in 2018, we went in, seeded a crop, followed by 1 application of a pesticide, and then harvesting the crop. And then we turned the bison out there and they grazed the residue. And then we went in again, seeded another crop, which included an annual and then a biannual. So we went in and sprayed, swathed the crop, and the bison just grazed it this year. And then this year, that crop regrew, we swathed it and harvested it. So in total, we had 10 passes over the field in 3 years, consuming 6.43 liters per acre in 1 year, for a total field consumption of 19.3 liters per acre in 3 years. So in a conventional system, that looks much different. And this is just based off one of our neighbors' fields, so not everyone is the same, but just kind of give you an idea of someone who is farming conventionally. There's typically a fertilizer tillage pass in the spring, followed by a pre-seed burn-off or chemical application, seeding the crop, spraying a herbicide, fungicide, followed by an insecticide, another fungicide, spraying the crop to desiccate it so that we can go in with the combine and harvest it, harrowing the stubble, and then usually a fall fertilizer pass, tillage pass happens again. So this was replicated for 3 years, all the same. And just goes to show you how many more passes over the field in a conventional system there is compared to what we're doing on our farm. A lot of passes over there with the sprayer and tillage, all the things that we are trying to reduce as much as possible. So the results that we came up with is that there was 30 passes over the field in 3 years, consuming a total of 21 liters per acre in 1 year. And then overall in the 3 years, it was 63 liters per acre. So that is 3.5 times more fuel consumption per acre than our farm. And we took these numbers off the Manitoba Ag website. Oops. So another part of our long-term plan at the farm was to wean off synthetics, meaning fertilizer and pesticides. And since 2015, the farm has reduced our use of nitrogen by 75%, and we've completely stopped using any phosphorus and potassium, which is very substantial. And then this corn crop here on the bottom of your screen on the right the corn on the right-hand side of me is grown with 0 pounds of nitrogen, and the corn on the left is grown with 110 pounds of nitrogen. Actually, what was the most interesting part about this trial was that the corn with 0 pounds of nitrogen out-yielded the corn with 110 pounds of nitrogen. And this trial kind of left us with a few more questions than answers, but ultimately what it comes down to is those synthetics are hurting the biology in the soil, and what would already naturally be available to the plant, we are harming with those synthetics. And yeah, it's a interesting observation we had made. Steve Kenyon, he's a mentor of mine that I look up to in the regenerative community. And he told me this once and it stuck with me forever. Modern agriculture grows plants from the soil. Regenerative agriculture grows soil from the plants. And I think once I understood that, it was kind of just gave me so much more passion about regen ag and what we're doing and all the positive impacts that we can have. So the soil here on the left-hand side of the screen, there's that dark, deep, rich looking soil filled with roots and aggregates and life. And then on the right-hand side, there's what I would call dead looking soil. There's some compaction layers, not a lot of root fibers or hairs, and it doesn't look very alive. So where would you want your food coming from, and where would you want it grown? There's many ways that we measure soil health on the farm. The first one being the power of observation. No one better than me or you knows your farm like anyone else. And so Brooks and I and whoever else are out there all the time checking our fields and understanding what is happening and going on.
I have a bit of a frozen screen here for Amber. Maybe we'll just leave it for a moment. Do you see that too, Jeanette? Yeah. One of the upsides of having this technology is we can have people from all across Manitoba and even Canada joining us, but one of the downsides is also the technological glitches here.
Molly, I'm going to stop Amber's video and just see if her audio kicks back in when I do that. Oh, she's gone altogether now before I could even do it. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, maybe there was a bad connection there. Well, that's unfortunate. I was really enjoying that presentation. So much important information in there. Maybe I'll just leave it for a moment to see if she can come back. It's just so incredible to hear that firsthand information from these super innovative farmers who are doing this work, and certainly to hear from the generation coming up as well about these practices. It's really, really exciting too. So yeah, I don't see her coming back. So maybe what we can do is we'll just proceed, and then when she comes back, we can see if she can finish her presentation. Does that sound okay? Okay. All right. Well, yeah, hopefully Amber will come back and can finish her presentation. It was super interesting. So in the meantime, we'll go to a poll. So this poll, I'll just ask Emily to bring that up. Thanks everybody for your patience and flexibility. I think those are the name of the game in 2020, patience and flexibility. All right, this is another series of options for you. The question is, what interventions are necessary for expanding healthy, sustainable, and just local food systems in Manitoba? What interventions are necessary to expand healthy, sustainable, and just local food systems? So multiple choice, up to 3. I suspect it'll also be hard to choose. The first here, option, provincial support programs for young and new entrant farmers. Second one, permanent residential status and protection of rights for migrant farm workers. Scale appropriate regulations for different sizes of farms and food processors. increased local food infrastructure, such as local food processing infrastructure and commercial. Next one, protection and support for Indigenous foodways and access to traditional foods. Policies and programs to make sustainable local foods accessible to all. And then not sure. Gosh, those are all important. I don't envy those of you voting here. Okay, we have 63 potential voters. And we have a lot of support coming in for what's kind of scale appropriate regulations. So stronger role for regulations here. Increased local food infrastructure, which is super important as we learned during COVID with the concentrated food processing, which led to outbreaks of COVID, as you well know. Policies and programs to make sustainable local food accessible to all. Very popular as well. Okay, we have 47 of 63 have participated. I don't see anybody else adding to that, so maybe we'll call it there. So yeah, the top answer here at 66%, switching around, was policies and programs to make sustainable local foods accessible to all, which is a good segue into Jeanette's presentation. Second runner up here, scale appropriate regulations for different sizes of farms and food processors. And the one after that was increased local food infrastructure, such as local food processing infrastructure and commercial. But obviously all of these are super important, and it's a comprehensive approach that's really needed. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. And I don't see Amber come back. So yeah, I guess we'll just move on to you, Jeanette, and I'll introduce you here. And then, yeah, if Amber comes back, maybe we can circle back to her presentation after yours. So I'm so pleased to introduce Jeanette Silvalay. She's the coordinator of the Winnipeg Food Council, a citizen advisory committee of the City of Winnipeg. Previously, she was an urban farmer in Winnipeg and a community organizer with a provincial network of small-scale farms. She holds an MA from the University of Manitoba, studying food sovereignty in Manitoba. And I also saw that you were noted as top 40 under 40 there, Jeanette.
Yeah. A really nice honor. Yeah, that just last week. Thanks.
Yeah. Do you know, Amber, welcome back. We waited a bit and then went to a poll, and now I just introduced Jeanette. We're all being flexible here. What do you say? Should we finish off with you, Amber, since you're back? Or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would be good to finish off.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, Jeanette. I know I just introduced you, but I think it makes sense with our attention. And thanks so much, Amber. I know it can be a bit frazzling when you have tech issues and you're presenting, and but
it won't let me share my screen. So.
Oh, okay. Do you
if
think
Emily can just.
Without that?
Just a moment.
Yes, I can go ahead.
Just hold up 1 second, Amber. I'm just fixing that issue.
Sorry about that.
Should be good now.
Well, I think since you left and came back, we had to give you permission again to do it. So yeah, do you want to give it a try?
There we go. Was it working for everyone?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, super interesting presentation. So yeah, thanks so much. Over to you again.
Okay, so another crucial part of our operation is integrating the bison on as many acres as possible. And this also allows us to sort of wean off some of our synthetics that we would typically be using through their manure. So our bison never see a feedlot or confinement. They graze 365 days a year, doing what bison do best. And bison are natural grazers, and they actually would much rather prefer the winter climate than in the summer sometimes. So we are direct marketing our bison meat to consumers for people who want their meat to have a story, and that is really important to us for consumers understanding how it was raised, where it comes from, and things like that. So our neighbor actually owns a feedlot. He feeds 1,000 cows in the winter. They run their tractor 7 hours a day for 7 months a year. And we feed 600 bison and we run our tractor 2 hours a week. And so that's just a comparison of how much we can reduce our emissions versus when the animals are grazing on the land versus when they're in a feedlot type system. Another program that we're working on is to become verified. So the Savory Institute is working on a verification process to kind of eliminate some greenwashing in the system. It's an outcome-based verification system, unlike some others. And ultimately, your food dollars can be supporting farms like us. So I encourage all of you to know where your food comes from, the story that it has, and even being in communication with these people, because I would be happy to tell anyone about how our animals are raised. Our farm has received help through the Manitoba government funding partnerships and programs such as Ag Action, Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Conservation Trust Project, and also our local conservation district. And with all these grants and funding opportunities and partnerships, we're able to provide ecological goods and services to our farm and also our community. So they're another very important piece of our operation. Often the biggest driver of change is something substantial, and for a lot of us in the farming community, that can be driven by economics. Although we may see and recognize the broken system that agriculture is on our farm, not other farmers are able to relate to that. So I think this graph shows it really well, where our profits are going in agriculture, and it's not to the farmer at the end of the day, it's into the retail companies and the input suppliers. Success is not always what you see. Much of reality is hidden from our view. Sometimes you need to look outside the box, or in our case, inside the soil. Visitors are welcome to the farm anytime, except of course, not during this pandemic we're in, but I hope to see visitors again soon so that we can keep sharing our story. In the meantime, you're welcome to follow us on social media and discover our world virtually. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for putting that together. There was just a comment in the chat that there might have been a couple more that we might have missed from Brooks White. I just mentioned there might have been a couple more slides that were missed in between there.
I think I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, just,
Great.
yeah, it's all good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Amber, that was just so interesting, and I just love the photos and the storytelling, and I'm connected with the Harvest Moon Society, and our slogan was, "Who's your farmer?" So it's just so great to get to know you as a grower, and particularly symbolic with the bison as Manitoba's official animal as well. So yeah, bring back the bison for sure. Thanks so much. Yeah, we'll have time for questions at the end. I think there are some questions, but we'll move to those at the end. So yeah, we'll turn it over to you, Jeanette. And yeah, I just been noting when I was introducing you that you were recognized as top 40 under 40 by CBC Manitoba. So congratulations on that. And really looking forward to your work with the Winnipeg Food Council. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. All right, so doing that screen sharing thing. Sorry, this is going to take me a second.
Oh, no worries.
Of course, I have the
We don't have anywhere to go.
All right, okay, we are working on this. This is not my first webinar to partake in, but my first one that I'm presenting at. So in this
Okay, try again.
All right. Here we go. Is this being a little bit more successful?
Yeah, there you go.
Great. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you for having me so much. I always look forward to opportunities where we can talk about agriculture and coming from the Food Council perspective, also kind of bridge that urban rural work that is so important, and I think particularly in Manitoba. So yeah, as Molly mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Winnipeg Food Council, and also just a year out of my grad school, actually, where I studied food sovereignty and the local food movement in Manitoba. So my presentation is going to draw on a few different hats, I suppose, but really looking forward to talking with you all, and really grateful to be speaking with among these other panelists as well. So I'm going to just start off with a little bit of a snapshot of agriculture in Manitoba, and then also talk about local food systems, and get into a little bit about why this is really important topics to talk about when we're talking about climate change, and when we're talking about the farm crisis too, that Darren touched on briefly. So agriculture is a really key driver in Manitoba's economy. Primary agriculture and food processing contributes to about 5% of Manitoba's GDP. And while our agriculture system is quite efficient and productive by certain standards, it's failed to maintain socially just and environmentally responsible food systems. The rise of our current conventional farming system has shifted emphasis away from family farming to large agribusiness and corporate agriculture that's primarily focused on international trade and export markets. And this, associated with the agricultural policy, has caused a get big or get out kind of mentality that's led to a mass exodus in farming. And we see this here in Manitoba as well, as you can see from some of the numbers on your screen. We've been experiencing a declining farming population here in the province, over decades. And there aren't enough new entrants to replace this loss. The average farm age is around retirement age. So this is really leading to fewer people on the landscape and fewer people farming in our province and across our country, really. And the resulting rural decline means that as areas are depopulated, they lose services and job opportunities, which is leading to an increase in rural poverty. So although agriculture is such a huge part of our economy here in Manitoba, and arguably we're pretty good at producing food and agricultural commodities, despite all of this, we still see a number of people who go without, and a large number of people experiencing household level food insecurity. So in 2019, the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority's Community Health Assessment found that 9.1% of households across the province have experienced household food insecurity. And when we're looking at the Winnipeg region, health region, pardon me, that number actually increases to over 10%. So we're really experiencing a struggle here as in our province. And as COVID-19 has shown us, sometimes in stark relief, a little bit more about our food system, as Molly kind of alluded to earlier. We've seen a food bank demand increase about 30% in the spring. And we also learned this summer about how dependent some of the ag sectors in Manitoba are on migrant farm workers. In the springtime, when farms were waiting to see if they would receive the same level of support through the temporary foreign workers coming into Canada, they really weren't sure what to expect with their season, and if they were going to get the same kind of skilled labor that they were used to getting. And then when migrant farm laborers did come, we started to see COVID outbreaks in some of these areas that really kind of exposed some of the precarious conditions that migrant farm laborers live in when they are in our system, despite us really needing them for these jobs and them being really skilled workers in our food system. And we also saw with meat processing plants, the outbreak of the Maple Leaf plant near Brandon, and some COVID cases also taking place at the Excelador poultry processing plant in Blue Manure. Again, seeing the cramped working conditions and the realization that we don't actually have a lot of places to process our meat across Canada, and shutdowns and disruptions at these processing plants have impacts across kind of a fragile food supply chain. So this kind of gets to a little bit about the farm crisis that Darren alluded to, and a significant symptom of our food system not working properly is agriculture's contribution to the climate crisis. So scaling up regional and local food systems are a really important part of climate change mitigation, but also climate change adaptation. While lower greenhouse gas emissions from food systems, from food related to supply chains and transportation are not quite as extreme as some of the emissions that we saw Darren talk about with synthetic nitrogen inputs and other kinds of farm inputs, it's still a really important angle that we need to talk about. I wasn't able to find any specific information from Manitoba, but some of the information that I was able to find, and those more knowledgeable than me can correct me down the road, but with Manitoba data perhaps, but some pinpoint that greenhouse gas emissions from the supply chain related to food account for about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, and with transportation being maybe about 6% in there. So those might not be exact numbers, but just to kind of give you a little bit of a perspective. But it's really important to still address these kinds of greenhouse gas emissions, and also really important for climate change mitigation is talking about low input agriculture, as we've been talking about tonight. And in Manitoba, in many cases, this type of agriculture is practiced by farmers who sell into local markets. So in a report that came out from the province of Manitoba in 2015, focused on the local food sector, it talked about some characteristics of small scale producers, kind of in general terms. And it indicated that small scale producers in Manitoba tend to have a limited land base, raise multiple types of livestock and crops, practice integrated farming methods, and market their products directly, either direct from the farm gate or through a farmer's market. And it also noted that there are actually a number of larger conventional farms that dedicate a portion of their farm to specialized local food production, and in fact have, in essence, have a local, a small scale operation kind of within their more conventional system. And in talking with local food producers also over the last 10 years, it's really clear that they are often motivated by the well-being of their communities and also the well-being of the land that they steward. Beefing up our local food system capacity and our regional food system capacity is even more important, I think, for climate change adaptation. In terms of economics, the small scale local food production in Manitoba represents just a tiny fraction of our food and beverage industry, and making it really clear that most of our food comes from far away. And we also lack our own capacity for local food processing, which we also touched on earlier. And we are dependent on these fairly fragile supply chains that are designed to be really efficient and deliver kind of a just enough, just in time mentality, but also which leaves them vulnerable. And one example that I often kind of use when I'm talking about shocks to our supply chain and food system and vulnerabilities that come from different areas is the impact that the detention of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou had on our canola market in Manitoba. And canola sales to China decreased around the same time. So, there was that. And then we also saw wildfires in California over the summer that caused haze in our skies here in Manitoba. And there were just reports released that the effect of those have started to increase food prices at grocery stores this fall. So we've seen those shocks, and we also have a lot of lessons from COVID-19. Empty grocery stores, shelves in the springtime led to a lot of increased interest in local food purchases. We heard a lot of farmers markets that were running at the time were experiencing increased demand. Some farmers reported that they sold out of a season's worth of meat in their freezers before the spring was even over. Vegetable seed sellers reported that they were starting to sell out. They were, becoming really backed up in being able to fill orders. Some of them even halted sales to individual buyers for a time because they were wanting to prioritize commercial operations first. And then we also heard reports that some seed sellers were dipping into their second year of seed supply already and selling it early because the demand was so high. And along those lines, also, we saw community-supported agriculture programs filling up much faster than usual in the spring as well. So it was really clear that when faced with food supply uncertainty, people were turning to their local food system to try and see what was available. And while we have a small local food system and kind of alternative agriculture sector in Manitoba compared with more conventional farming, it is really quite vibrant. We have over 115 farmers markets in the province and more than 20 CSA farms, which is from the data that I've been able to find are at our highest level, and over 150 people who are members of Direct Farm Manitoba, which is our provincial co-op for farm and farmers selling direct to consumer and also for farmers markets. And we've heard that able to support this kind of local food system, what we've been hearing from small scale food producers, particularly loudly since 2013 when we had the Harborside Farms raid, is that they really are in need of scale appropriate regulations. They continue to tell us through different reports and through experiences that they're having is that agriculture policies and programs in Manitoba are really kind of shaped with a more large scale type of agriculture in mind. And one of their largest barriers is the lack of regulatory, attention to these types of food production systems. So that's pretty significant. And then also another one is support for new entrants. So when people want to begin, farming for the first time, access to land, mentorship opportunities, educational opportunities are really important. I also think as we've seen increased urbanization in Manitoba, a lot of our rural population has remained pretty stable across the country over the last number of years, and our increase in population has been in urban areas. And as we've seen kind of rural depopulation over the years, it's begun to impact our understanding of the food system as people move off of the land. We're losing essential knowledge of how food is grown, what to grow and where to grow it and how to grow it. And I think although we don't think about it very often, and maybe not in this way, eating is one of the most intimate ways we engage with the natural world. We consume nature and it becomes us. It's easier to care for something, I think, when we understand it. And we don't seem to often think necessarily about our food. And I think this is why acts like gardening and getting involved in some kind of growing food is really important to understand how soil interacts with seed, and to connect with those natural systems can really help us to develop a bit of an ethic of care for our environment, which I think is really important in motivating people to act on climate change. Working with our neighbors to feed ourselves can help us understand how important it is to care for our environment. And on a more practical note, it also helps us reskill and learn how to feed ourselves into the future. And I think this is where community food production has a really crucial role to play. why we need things like community gardens and neighborhood gardening co-ops, land trusts in urban areas to protect against development pressures and urban farms. These are tools that can help us develop this ethic of care and learn about what it means to produce food. So I know some of you are thinking, well, Jeanette, this sounds really fantastic. Local food, you know, that's really lovely. We need to increase our regional food systems capacity. Totally agreed. But isn't local food really outside of the scope of what most people can access? Isn't it more expensive? And isn't it, you know, primarily available at farmers markets? And I definitely hear what you're saying. And this is a question that's been asked again and again, I think, in the food justice movement. And I'm reminded that it's also asked in the climate justice movement, that we need to ensure that these kinds of foods that are grown with net zero emissions and that are you know, part of our regional food systems are accessible to all Manitobans. And, you know, this is, you know, to say that food currently, as we know, is inaccessible to a lot of folks to begin with, never mind local food options or net zero emissions food options. So it's definitely a really, really important topic that we need to be talking about. And I wanted to give a few examples of some actions that are being undertaken today by different farms and organizations across Manitoba to give you a sense of what people are doing in the province. And, you know, with the note that while programs can help fill gaps in this area, we really do need policies that address this really, really critical issue. So first of all is the Manitoba Community Food Currency Program. This was piloted just this year by Direct Farm Manitoba, which, as I mentioned, is a cooperative of direct market farmers and farmers markets across Manitoba. It was originally, it was in the books already for 2020, and then it expanded in scope due to COVID-19. And it aims to increase fresh, local, and whole foods and increase overall food security outcomes for members of the community who face poverty and food insecurity, while also supporting local sustainable agricultural systems. So in delivering the program, they partner with social service organizations to identify individuals who can benefit and then provide them with vouchers that they can use in different local food marketplaces. And it's modeled off of a pretty successful program from the British Columbia Association of Farmers Markets. This is one farm, this is just a few examples, and this is one example of a farm that's working at this as well through their food accessibility program. And Troy and Michelle, the farmers there, they say that this program came out of a painful awareness that the grass-fed beef, lamb, and honey were not financially available to a lot of folks in Manitoba. So they started a food accessibility program in partnership originally with the Westman Immigration Services in Brandon. This was in 2019. And in 2020, they expanded the program, again with COVID-19 in mind, to put together a meat share subscription program for households who self-identify as low income to access this meat share program at 50% of the original price. They also have a gift card program where they offer preloaded gift cards in partnership with community-based organizations that folks can use to purchase their farm products. Hard Acres Farm runs a community-supported agriculture model just south of Winnipeg, really, really close to the city. I think it's interesting to note that their CSA farm is on the first, it's called Hard Acres Farm now. It used to be called the Wiens Shared Farm, and it was the first CSA farm in Manitoba. For those who don't know, CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. It used to be more frequently called community shared agriculture, and we call it community supported agriculture now more for some reason, which I don't know. But the idea with community supported agriculture, I think, which is also really interesting for climate change, is it's this idea that it pursues an alternative way of organizing food and farming, where people pay upfront for their food, and then they get a box of food throughout the season of what's in season, what's ready to harvest. And so it really kind of gets people investing in the kinds of food and production systems that they believe in. And it's a system where community shares in the risk. And so this is really important, particularly as farmers work with natural systems, and climate change brings about more uncertainty in terms of storms and droughts, diseases and pests, because climate change will leave farmers increasingly vulnerable, and agriculture stability and support programs in Manitoba aren't available to farmers who farm on this size. So the community supported agriculture model becomes increasingly important in that kind of a context. So Heartacres Farm has a sliding scale price model. They kind of follow the solidarity share model from Soul Fire Farms in the United States, and then also have a sliding scale to help those who can, put money into the program to allow people who can't to be able to access this food as well. And they also have partnerships with West Broadway Good Food Club and the Mosaic Newcomer Family Resource Network. Fireweed Food Co-op is the first cooperatively owned food hub in Manitoba. They're located in Winnipeg, and they the food hub program itself is really interesting, and then also their Waste Not local food box program. The food hub is designed to help fill gaps in the supply chain that smaller scale and regional producers often struggle to bridge. So it's kind of this, we've got super small producers, local farms over here, and then we've got, conventional ag over here. Well, what's in the middle? And that what's in the middle question is really important for small scale producers, but also for processing and other parts of the chain as well. And so this food hub model, the idea is that they can help aggregate and distribute local food products that can then fill larger orders at restaurants and things like that, but also down the line for institutional sales as well. So it's really exciting, and it helps to keep money in the local economy, ensure that small farms also have a future, which is a big part of food security in the region as well. So so that's really exciting about their food hub. And then also they have this Waste Not local food box program that they've put together in partnership with the Mutual Aid Society of Winnipeg to allow farmers market vendors and food hub participants, as well as a lot of community gardens and individuals, to donate to this Waste Not food box program that they distribute along with the Mutual Aid Society on Thursdays. And then the Meadowood Victory Garden was an initiative of the Winnipeg Food Council this year, where we were able to access some space at a municipal building, at an arena owned by the city, operated by the community. And we were, as part of the COVID-19 response, we wanted to highlight the Victory Garden mentality that we saw kind of coming back into mind for folks. So the idea of a Victory Garden is that during times of crisis, such as during World War I and World War II and the Great Depression, people grew food primarily in urban areas, but in any patch of land that they could find as a real means of feeding themselves. And I think there were reports that at one point, home, school, and community gardens were able to produce around 40% of the fresh vegetable production in the United States from the Victory Garden movement. So we wanted to kind of highlight that with this. So we partnered with a housing cooperative across the street, and also we're able to provide partner with the North End Food Security Network and the North End Stay and Play daycare program to provide fresh local food to folks who might not otherwise be able to access it. So that's basically the end of my presentation. I wanted to just highlight a few other organizations that are working in this area in the province that you should go and check out. And a lot of them have, two of them have conferences going on this month that are all online and super accessible. And then another conference happening in February. This is the thing that I realized when I started getting involved in agricultural circles, is that winter is for conferences. And that's great, and that's fun. Yeah, so thanks for your time today. I think I took up a little bit more of it than I was supposed to, but yeah.
Lots of exciting things happening, and great to share them, so thanks so much. It's good to hear about the Victory Garden. That was a thought of mine when COVID was going on. It's so therapeutic even to just think about gardening in the middle of winter, and also knowing that we'd be restricted this year. So it's great that that got underway. Thanks so much, Jeanette. So we have a final poll, and then we have some time for questions and discussion here. So we'll just go to our very last poll, and Emily can pull that up, please. This one's about how to be involved in creating change here, positive change. How would you like to be involved in work to create better climate and emission reduction policies and programs in Manitoba? So you can choose all that apply. So how do you want to get involved? And these are the options. Participate in direct action and rallies, once those become possible. Write to or take part in meetings with politicians. Join or volunteer with an organization promoting sustainable food and farming systems. Contribute financially. I support the work but cannot contribute at this time. That's one of the things about COVID, is organizing during this time is restricted, although there are some really creative things people are doing. Art is a low emitting way of getting a point across, writing letters, phone calls to politicians, things like that. There have been some honkathons, which are not low GHG emitting activities, unless you go on a bicycle or by foot, and bring your pots and pans to bang at the legislature. So yeah, a lot of people wanting to write to or take part in meetings with politicians. I suspect we have a lot of engaged people who are already here with us tonight. So that's great. Join or volunteer with an organization promoting sustainable food and farming systems like the NFU or many others. Participate in direct action and rallies once those become possible. It's also very popular. So yeah, it sounds like everybody is very involved here. And yeah, there's obviously many tactics and approaches needed. So that's great. I'm glad that you're all very connected here, and encourage you to, and all of us, to keep that going, even though it seems like the change is not happening fast enough. We have to do what we can, obviously. So thanks so much. Thanks for helping us with that poll there, Emily. I wanted to note that I stand to be corrected here about the questions for accessibility. So if somebody does need to ask a question using the raise hand due to accessibility reasons, please go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll proceed with our questions that have been in the chat here. That is the way, if that's the way you need to ask a question for accessibility, we'll take a question from by raising a hand. So I just want to ask the first questions for Darren, and I'll ask them both together, so maybe you can answer together. The question was, during your presentation, Anastasia asked, what makes Manitoba the leader in agricultural emissions compared to Saskatchewan, and how do we compare to North and South Dakota? And then the other question, which is a huge question, but I'm sure you can do it justice in a short response, which is it a coincidence that farm inputs have risen at the same time farmers were told they were a business and not a lifestyle? i.e. post-World War II? What happened after post-World War II? And that's what I get from that question.
Yeah, thanks for both those questions. In reverse order, farm input use has risen for a lot of reasons, and the industrialization and the businessification of agriculture both play parts in it, but partly too, agriculture, like so much of the economy, was restructured. It used to have a basis in biology, and its basis was switched over to industry. It used to be solar powered. Literally the people and the horses ran on crops and food grown from the sun, and then it became fossil fueled. So like the rest of the economy, there's just been this transition from solar to fossil, and from biology to industry, and farming, and just about every other system has gone that same way. So that's part of the reason that the emissions have gone up over the last 100 years. And the other question, why is agriculture such a big part of the Manitoba emissions picture? And actually, when Jeanette was speaking, it occurred to me that 43% is probably a bit low. When you take the other pieces of the food system into account, it's probably about half, the driving to get food and transport of food and in-home preparation and everything. But one of the reasons agriculture is such a big part is twofold. One, agriculture is just a big part of what the province does. But the other thing, which is kind of a good news part of this, is parts of the province aren't very high emitting. One of the reasons that the proportion in Saskatchewan is lower is because there's a lot of emissions in Saskatchewan from other sources, one of them being coal-fired power plants. So the clean electricity generation, when you remember that pie chart, there was no part of that pie that was emissions from the generation of electricity. So that makes all the other things a little larger. So it's a good news, bad news story there.
Okay, so part of our response needs to have ethical hydro sold to Saskatchewan in higher quantities so they get off coal, for example. But okay, thanks so much for that, Darren. Amber, we had some questions for you, and some of them are technical and some of them are a bit less so. Dean Harder asked, why is the cattle farmer next to you running their tractors so much constantly? And what do you do with your tractors with the bison? Just curious the relationship there, I guess.
So in a feedlot situation, you are running your tractor all day long to provide feed for those animals. And in order to do that, it takes a long time. And in our system, we're not feeding every day. They're grazing what we have either grown from a cover crop, corn residue, and crop residue. So therefore, we aren't needing to start the tractor every day. And bison are wild animals, so they needed to be treated as such. And I am familiar with working with them, but it takes experience to work with the animals.
Mm-hmm. And Brooks asked, can you give an example of how grain intercrop reduces the need for nitrogen fertilizer and reduces NO2?
So in intercrops, we often use plants that fix nitrogen in the soil, such as peas, legumes. And so therefore that reduces our use of nitrogen because the plants are naturally cycling that nitrogen and then feeding our crop that we harvest, therefore reducing our use of nitrogen fertilizer.
Okay. And Marianne had a comment, and can be like a question. I'm also curious about this. She says it would be helpful to also understand the farm budgets that go along with the comparison between regenerative and degenerative.
Yes, they are interesting. We have a lot less expenses versus a conventional farm because we are not using the inputs that others do, and therefore we also reduce our expenses by utilizing the livestock to harvest crops instead of machines and equipment. So that's where our budgets and expense income differ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of relates to Marianne's other comment, which was related to Jeanette, which is she comments about the exploitation of farm workers can be paid for by ending costly inputs. And so, you know, if we're not, farmers have other options other than buying these expensive inputs, then it could reduce the cost rather than raising the food at the till. Do you have any comments on that, or
Yeah, for sure.
straightforward, or?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I just think that if a farm can be more profitable by reducing our costs, then our food prices should be reflected in that. The unfortunate part is that we are a smaller scale compared to factory farming, and therefore our expenses are much higher because we are not working to the scale that many of these facilities need. And yeah, it is a struggle for us to be able to have food prices reflect what a conventional system does just based on the scale of our operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's such an important issue here, is the scale and scaling up much more rapidly than we've been doing in order to address the dire need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Amber. This is for you, Jeanette. There's a question or comment from Katie. And she says, some argue that local versus regenerative are not the same conversation. Local food systems are only workable for consumers who are close to farm supply. So can large farms use regenerative agriculture on a large scale so that the farm is able to access larger markets, attain a living income, and stop environmental degradation? So actually, I'm not sure if that's for you, Jeanette. I don't know if you want to comment. I mean, Darren might also, or Amber, please just join in if you have anything to add on that. Maybe we'll start with you, Jeanette, since I.
Yeah, sure. I'm just reading the question again, and yeah, I mean, in terms of you know, local food systems and I guess folks being close to where food is produced. I know in Manitoba, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I know that in Manitoba, we have a bit of an interesting situation where the largest market for you know, local food products and direct sales to consumers is in Winnipeg. So there are actually farms who live quite close to the Saskatchewan border who will drive into Winnipeg from time to time for drop-offs to do those sales, and it really is kind of based on where the market is. So I don't know if that helps kind of shed some light on the answer to this question, but I think that may be one piece of it. But yeah, I would definitely ask you know, Darren or Amber to weigh in with some of their knowledge as well.
I know for us, we're 4 hours from Winnipeg, and we still make bi-weekly trips into the city to deliver our food products because that's where the market is, and that's where the food needs to go. So that's what we do.
Darren, do you have anything to add about scaling up regenerative? No? Okay, thanks. Well, there's some other questions in the chat here, but I think I'm going to leave it with this question from Ian Robson, because it's a good one to talk about the systemic change that's needed. And he asks, we've seen the accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, the situation in farming, the need for local food. How can we unplug from imported food and grow and process our own food more locally and cycle all our vital elements while we make more local jobs, increase quality food, while meet our goal of getting off fossil fuel use? Seems difficult to do with fewer farmers and large corporations supplying the bulk of our food. So how do we make this paradigm shift? It's a big question. Anybody want to give it a try?
I can say a couple things about it. The points that Ian raised are actually really connected in a lot of ways. So one way to tell the story about the Canadian agricultural system is to note that the prime directive in Ottawa and probably in Winnipeg as well, is to maximize food exports. In Agriculture Canada, the main driver, the main metric, the big gauge they have in the middle of their dashboard is agricultural exports measured in billions of dollars. If you want to maximize exports, you also then have to maximize production. To do that, you have to maximize inputs. And when you do that, you maximize emissions. So the drive for exports leads you to a system that's very high emission. So that's the first connection. But the other thing it does is it causes you to then be very avid about signing free trade agreements, which then breaks open your market for a flood of food coming in. So it's a massive project of delocalizing foods. And we're shipping food in one direction, and sometimes the same food's coming back in the other direction too. So the really federal and provincial policies have really led to a far-flung food system, a productivist food system, a high-emission food system, and one that makes a focus on local a little more challenging.
Yeah, and I would add to that a little bit to say that that's why we talk about scale-appropriate regulation, and we talk about the need for attention to local food systems a little bit more with agricultural subsidies, agricultural programs that support different methods of production. And I think, yeah, like that's going to be really crucial. It's almost when I talk about kind of alternative food production in Manitoba, like I almost it's almost like the agricultural programs and policies that are in place almost stream farms into a certain type of production. So when you're talking about wanting to do anything else, then you're automatically doing something else that looks quite different and doesn't have the kind of support programs that are available for larger scale farms that are producing for export markets. So yeah, that's a big question from Ian. It doesn't surprise me at all, but yeah, I think that's he sums up this evening really nicely, I feel like.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ian. Amber, do you have anything to add or any? No, good. Okay, well, folks, we're at our time. I'm sure we could there's so many questions in the chat. I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but these folks are pretty easy to find. And I really wish to extend a huge thank you to Darren Qualdman from the National Farmers Union, Amber McNish, and Jeanette Silvalet for participating and sharing your knowledge and putting all the time and effort into this presentation and being flexible, patient and flexible in this environment with this Zoom webinar. And thanks to everybody who's watching out there. Hello, I wish we were all in the same room. But I know we're together in spirit and in solidarity with food sovereignty and food security here in Manitoba in the face of the climate crisis. And I was really buoyed by everybody's interest and willingness to write to politicians and stay involved with great organizations. So please, let's just keep it up. We have to keep our momentum up. This is a huge shift we're going through right now. And I think public health argument will be as strong as the climate argument for relocalizing our food systems. And so on that, I'll thank our sponsors for this event, the Winnipeg Food Council, the Climate Action Team, the National Farmers Union, the Manitoba Eco Network, and Emily, our tech support. Thank you so much, Emily. And I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. This will be posted on YouTube and on Facebook with Manitoba Eco Network. So thanks again, everybody. Stay safe and stay well. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.